Hello, my name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of the Idaho Humanities Council and Humanities Washington, I'd like to welcome you out to our academic forum today on democracy and civility. We have 5 separate panels throughout the day today, looking at the relationship between democracy and civility from various aspects and various viewpoints in the humanities. It's appropriate that our first panel today is actually examining this question from the perspective of history. We have 4 distinguished historians with us today, and I was reminded of the great philosopher of history, Hegel, made a comment once, and he said that the only consistent lesson from history is that people and nations fail to learn from history. But despite that, I have asked our historians to tell us what lessons we can draw from American history with respect to thinking about how civility and democracy interact and how they are important in terms of reaching questions of the common good. We will begin today with Professor Fred Logevall, who's on my left. Fred Logevall is a John S. Knight Professor of International Studies and Professor of History at Cornell University, where he serves as the director of the Mario Inati Center for International Studies. His most recent works are America's Cold War, The Politics of Insecurity, published by the Harvard University Press in 2009, and A People and a Nation, A History of the United States, with Mary Norton, now in its 9th edition. His book, The Twilight War, The End of the Beginning in Vietnam, is forthcoming with Random House. Professor Logevall.
Thank you, Cornell. It's just a pleasure for me to be here with you this morning and to be part of this panel, and want to be ruthless about sticking to Cornell has been very vigilant about the fact that we need to stick to no more than 10 minutes. I'll try to come in a little less than that. I guess it's obligatory almost for a historian, and I think it's a theme perhaps on this panel to some degree, to suggest, as was also said last night, that there really was no golden age of political geniality and decorum in the United States. It wasn't true at the founding of the Republic or in the years thereafter, and I don't think it's been true, broadly speaking, since. We've had, interestingly enough, periods of, shall we say, relative calm, and it might be interesting, in fact, to talk about that. But those periods, I think, have been intermittent at best, and so I would suggest, as I do in my abstract, that we should resist golden ageism, as I call it, on this subject. The interesting question for me is why? Why is it that democracies, and perhaps especially the United States, maybe there's a certain exceptionalism here that we can talk about also in the Q&A, or maybe in later panels. Why is it that democracies, and perhaps especially the United States, are not very good at public discussions on complex issues? And in anticipation of this panel this morning, I reread Alexis de Tocqueville's classic work that I think we all know about, Democracy in America, published 1835 and 1840, arguably still the most incisive inquiry, I think, into the society, polity, and culture of the United States perhaps ever published. And I think that Tocqueville has much to teach us on this question. I find power, for example, in his argument that Americans' ideology of equality, Americans' faith in equality, has a flip side, a kind of dark, maybe a dark underbelly, we could say, because it can give Americans a sense of self-righteousness, a sense of entitlement, allow Americans to speak about things they don't know very much about with great authority, and Americans don't countenance much the idea that somebody knows more than they do. There's a deep skepticism about experts and expertise that I think Tocqueville identified and I think that we still have. He has a biting phrase that I just want to quote. He says, Americans are constantly, and I quote, constantly brought back to their own reason as the most obvious and proximate source of truth, unquote. And we heard last night from Stephen Carter, excuse me, we heard last night from Stephen Carter that Richard Hofstadter played on some of these themes a little bit more than a century later, arguing that anti-intellectualism is an outgrowth of Americans' belief that all men are equal. He says that our anti-intellectualism is in fact older than our national identity, which I guess means that we're a nation of know-it-alls, which can make for a really noisy public discourse. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's a price of democracy. Tocqueville, for one, wasn't very concerned about this. He was comparing, even though it's, I think, implicit in the work in Democracy in America, he was comparing at all times the United States to his own native land, France, which is understandable. And more than was the case in France, Tocqueville believed, I think rightly, that Americans from different backgrounds more often than not managed to find common ground, or at least to tolerate their differences. That was very important for him. This was the essence of the democratic system, and arguably still is the essence of the democratic system. The willingness to compromise, to seek compromise solutions instead of demanding complete victory over one's opponents. But there is a paradox, and I want to just devote my final moments to talking a little bit about this paradox. This is something that I don't really bring out very much in the abstract that I sent out for this panel. But I want to throw the following out to you and see if this resonates. The know-it-allism that I referred to also, I think, can make us intellectually lazy, can incline us to follow the pack on any given subject. Again, one final quote from Tocqueville, and you've probably heard this one. Quote, I do not know of any country where in general less independence of mind and genuine freedom of discussion reign than in America, unquote. It's a debatable assertion, actually. One could probably think of numerous other societies, but nevertheless, I think he's onto something in making this suggestion. And I want to talk about it for just a few minutes in the context of my own field of specialization, which is U.S. foreign relations history. And you could argue here, and I'll suggest why, that the problem is not an absence of civility, but a surfeit. And what I mean is this, and I'll just give a couple of examples, or maybe three. In the early Cold War, the range of acceptable opinion in Washington vis-à-vis policy toward the Soviet Union narrowed dramatically. So dramatically, I would suggest that it essentially ceased to exist. Democrats in particular, and also moderate Republicans who were afraid of being tagged as soft on communism, avoided asking hard questions about the Truman administration's expansive policy of containment. They avoided asking large questions about the nature of the Soviet threat, about Stalin's, or connecting Stalin's hostility, which was one thing, to his intentions, to his capabilities, with, I think, and we can talk about this, a pernicious, a very negative impact on the making of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War. That's the first example. Second, Lyndon Johnson's escalation in Vietnam in 1964 and 65, I have argued elsewhere, occurred within what I call a permissive context. We know it's very clear from the evidence, and it's striking, the degree to which the Senate Democratic leadership and many other top lawmakers in Congress were in fact privately opposed to an escalation of the war, were skeptical that the war in Vietnam could be won, even that it needed to be fought. And yet they were not willing to say so to Lyndon Johnson. They were not willing to say so by and large publicly. And of course, the results again were disastrous. Among the general public, most Americans were apathetic about Vietnam in 64 and 65. Most in the press avoided asking large questions. And again, what you heard, and I wish I could find the quote, I think it's Wayne Morse, who was one of the few lawmakers in Congress who really spoke out against the war. He, in effect, said, in so many words, and I'm paraphrasing, we have too much civility on this question. This discussion is too genteel about what we should be doing in Vietnam. We need to be asking tough, tough questions. Again, that's a paraphrase. I wanted to find the quote for this conference, and I couldn't do it. Finally, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, same kind of permissive context was, it seems to me, in evidence on the part of Congress, leading members of the press, including top reporters in the New York Times, and again, the general public in terms of its apathy. So the question, I guess, is where this leaves us, and I'm not quite sure. Still working through some of my thoughts on this. I want to believe that there's a normative ideal with respect to civility, that it's not just about context, not just about strategizing, using civility for political purposes, that it's about respect for civic order, tolerance of differences, some of the things that we heard discussed last night, conduct worthy of a citizen. So that's, on the one hand, I think that's important. I'm also mindful of Benjamin Franklin's famous advice that the first responsibility of every citizen is to question authority. And maybe I would amend, if I dare, slightly, Franklin's admonition. Perhaps one should say that the first responsibility of every citizen is to become informed on the issues and to question authority. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Our next presenter is Lisa McGirr. Professor McGirr is a professor of history at Harvard University. She specializes in the history of the 20th century in the United States. Her research and teaching interests bridge the fields of social and political history and focus in particular on collective action, political culture, reform movements, and political ideology. She's currently working on a book entitled Prohibition in the Making of Modern America. Her award-winning first book, Suburban Warriors, The Origin of the New Right, investigates the social and regional basis of grassroots level conservative politics in post-war United States. Lisa.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I think this conference suggests, and the establishment just in recent days of a National Civility Institute in Arizona, that civility has, in fact, become quite a hot topic. There is a sort of, if one is to believe in doing a kind of Google search of the World Wide Web, a kind of cottage industry of sorts that has sprung up in recent years. Civility workshops, books, as I mentioned, this institute, and even bumper stickers, Choose Civility, have sprung up across the country, all lamenting the state of our political discourse. Some declare that we must bring civility back. Others, even more sort of convinced about the power of nice or polite social behavior to remake one's life, go so far to declare in that all-American way, civility will make you rich. Amazingly enough. These initiatives, both the more serious as well as the frivolous, share the assumption that a loss of civility lays at the heart of what is wrong with contemporary America. This is a story of declension. Indeed, as Professor Clayton put it yesterday, we seem to be, and this is what many would argue, at a nadir in our political discourse. In the past, this narrative would have it, Americans did share a kind of common set of assumptions about what constitute appropriate and respectful forms of democratic discourse and practice. The tendency sort of in this discourse, or the kind of subtext, is that if only we would listen to one another more, respect one another more, respect the other side, the way we used to, we could come to some better understanding of the common good. Such arguments, I believe, really do belie the history of politics in America because, to put it very bluntly, and this is something Professor mentioned already last night, incivility is as American as apple pie. Unruly political discourse and practice, for better or for worse, has been at the core, and this is something Fred also mentioned, and Tocqueville discussed, is at the core of the American experience. But as importantly, civility and incivility are not inherently good or bad for democracy. Calls for civility, for example, have been utilized in the past to thwart democratic mobilization. At no moment was this more in evidence than during the Civil Rights Movement, as both Michael Kazin and Tom Sugrue will affirm in their remarks today. Calls to go slow, to cool off, to be polite and nice by whites in power sought to slow the urgent and disruptive claims by African Americans for their rights. Jazz singer and civil rights activist Nina Simone no better articulated the problematic relationship between propriety and power than in her angry, passionate, and rather uncivil, by the standards of yesteryear or today, song, Mississippi Goddamn. Written in the wake of the Birmingham 63 bombings where 4 school children were killed, Simone crooned angrily with a contemptuous tone, "Yes, you lied to me all these years. You told me to wash and clean my ears and talk real fine, just like a lady, and you'd stop calling me Sister Sadie. Oh, but this whole country is full of lies. You're all gonna die and die like flies. I don't trust you anymore. You keep on saying, go slow." Simone's words were heard by civil rights marchers and sung at rallies, just as was Amazing Grace and We Shall Overcome. But they've been somewhat written out of the history of a movement that sanitizes civil rights as sort of the epitome, kind of the high point of civil discourse and behavior. I point to this to remind us that loud, rude, disdainful speech have been deployed effectively and have served as important tools in struggles to expand democratic rights. Let me point to one more example. Right here in Spokane, Washington, in 1909, a historic battle, as many of you know, took place over the appropriate parameters of public speech. The radical labor organization, Industrial Workers of the World, came to Spokane to organize the region's timber workers. To raise attention to their cause, they engaged in a wide variety of tactics. They utilized provocative and inflammatory speech on the city's streets, where employers, better known as sharks, did their recruiting. Organizers condemned the capitalists as thieves and called for industrial sabotage. Local authorities deemed the organization dangerous, barbarous, and their soapboxing conversation was banned from the public square. Local Salvation Army preachers condemning sinners and seeking souls for Jesus, however, were able to continue shouting their lungs out from the city's street corners. The Industrial Workers of the World proceeded to engage in civil disobedience. They stood on overturned crates in the city's street corners and with a fighting, passionate words decried the city's fathers for class warfare and shouted down the local police, who arrested one after another. The organization flooded the city's jails until they achieved an end to the banning of free speech, an end to the ordinance, which was rescinded a year later. The campaign, by the standards of that day, as well as by the standards that many hold of civility today, would be considered uncivil, impolite, impassioned, inflammatory, indeed downright rude. But it contributed to the expansion of democracy. My point here, again, is the importance of remembering that civility and incivility have been strategies and tools and political arsenals utilized both to limit as well as expand democratic rights. Whether civility or incivility has been good or bad for democracy has depended on the historic context and purpose for which they have been deployed. So I raise then a kind of cautionary note in our discussions about civility. There can be, and this is something that Fred pointed out in arguing that perhaps we have a surfeit of civility, there can be a danger in placing too much weight on the importance of common public norms or rules of polite discourse and behavior, of manners that govern public speech. At the very least, it seems to me, it can contribute to narrowing the possible parameters of hard, contentious debate that are necessary for robust democratic conversation. It is also, I believe, a dialogue that perhaps can distract us from more substantive issues. Indeed, while many, and I think it's obviously extremely important to talk about respectful disagreement, the discussions of civility and democracy have often devolved into a discussion about etiquette and conversation. Bruce Cole, the past chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, held a long interview with that queen of etiquette, Judith Martin, better known as Miss Manners, to precisely discuss the relationship of civility to democracy, with Miss Manners serving as an expert on standards of behavior in U.S. history. So the contemporary debate over the problem of rowdy, rude, boisterous, impolite behavior does remind me of one earlier era and one that I'm studying currently. In the early 20th century, middle-class Protestant reformers sought to improve the quality of American life and democracy by banishing the loud, raucous world of public working-class drink in the nation's saloons. Well-intentioned reformers, first through education and eventually through law, sought to end intemperance, promote moderation, and put an end to the immoral, as it was termed, uncivil saloon, which they saw as an impediment to good working democracy. By 1920, as many of you know, such well-intentioned reformers succeeded in passing the 18th Amendment, outlawing public drink in the United States for 14 years. As one social worker remarked on the change in her own home state of South Dakota in the wake of Prohibition, "Isn't it heavenly to be in a city where there are no saloons? We have much less disorder due to the absence of drunken people on the streets and in public places." And another remarked that even where drinking persisted, the drinkery is no longer a political center. But this effort to remake the public sphere, to make it more civil, ended with the trampling of individual rights. The desire to create an ordered, temperate nation for the common good ended in vast lawlessness and the violation of individual freedoms. It contributed, for example, to the dynamic growth, in fact, of the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s, which gained between 2 and 5 million members. The Klan grew in part because of concerns over shifting gender norms, racial militancy, and labor upheaval after World War I, but its recruitment drives gained great strength and legitimacy by their claims to enforce law and order, to end the flagrant violations of the Prohibition law. Klan chapters raided immigrant, Catholic, and African American communities under the guise of enforcing the law. The massive violation of citizen rights that ensued, with good intentions gone awry, led one civil liberties advocate, Clarence Darrow, to lament the psychology of hate and bitterness that has been cultivated, which makes any act of cruelty possible. That great noble experiment, the experiment of remaking American behavior, of improving American manners and mores, ended, as Clarence Darrow put it, in tyranny and despotism. While there is clearly, at the moment, no effort to legislate allowable behavior in our discussions of civility, as there was with the great temperance movement of 100 years ago, the story, I think, of Prohibition does point to some risks inherent in focusing too much attention on public mores and manners. I'd like to end just by pointing to the response of one great president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to the attacks that were made on him as a communist, which were rife in the 1930s. As he put it in one address, partisans not willing to face realities will drag out red herrings, as they always have done, to divert attention from the trail of their own weaknesses. This practice is as old as our democracy. But Franklin D. Roosevelt, in the wake of this, did not call for a national dialogue on civility. In fact, he argued that Americans must not be distracted, and this is now a paraphrase, I couldn't refine the quote, but that Americans would not be distracted from the great public policy issues of the day by such red herrings. And it's in a moment, I think, where substantive issues are on the table about the future direction of the nation, where issues of public policy will, in fact, determine the shape of our democracy, that I would call on us not to be too distracted with the issues of civil discourse and to focus attention on, as Fred has also called us to having true, robust democratic conversations, to continuing to ask hard questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Michael Kazin. Professor Kazin is a professor of history at Georgetown University and also the co-editor of the journal Dissent. He writes about the history of politics and social movements in the United States, and he's a regular columnist for the New Republic Online and a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and the American Prospect. His books include American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation. It's forthcoming this year. A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. The Popular Persuasion, An American History. And America Divided, The Civil War of the 1960s. It's now in its 4th edition. He also was the editor of the Princeton Encyclopedia of American Political History. Professor Kazin.
Thank you. Thank you, Cornell, and thank you to everybody at WSU and humanities centers both in Idaho and Washington who's put this together. It's a real treat to be here. You will note in my remarks and also in Tom's a certain harmony on the panel. We're very civil with one another, no matter what we think about civility. That may be a good or bad thing. We can discuss that. I'm glad Lisa quoted some song lyrics. I'm going to start my talk in that same way, different song, however. And I basically want to talk for the little time I have about the same issue that Lisa raised of civility and social movements in the U.S., because social movements is pretty much what I work on. And the song is a song by Malvina Reynolds, who's perhaps best known to folks here for writing the song Little Boxes, If You See Weeds on Showtime. Used to be the theme song for that show. But before she wrote that, she wrote a song which was one of my favorite songs in the 1960s, a song about the tactics used by the Civil Rights Movement, entitled It Isn't Nice. Here's just one verse of that song. It isn't nice to block the doorway. It isn't nice to go to jail. There are nicer ways to do it, but the nice ways always fail. It isn't nice, it isn't nice. You told us once, you told us twice. But if that's freedom's price, we don't mind. This is an interesting text, I think. I'm going to sort of talk about it in various ways, because I think it raises a number of questions about the uses, the limits, and the meaning of civility in the history of social movements, particularly American ones. And I mean civility here, as both Lisa and Fred have, as language and behavior, not just one or the other. First of all, contrary to Reynolds' lyric, the behavior of the Civil Rights Movement in its so-called classic phase from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s was not uncivil, at least in the contemporary meaning of the term. After all, activists like those who Reynolds was defending, and she was one of them herself, engaged in peaceful disobedience. They did refuse to recognize their white racist opponents as rational people, most of them at least. They thought they were horribly wrong and wanted to say that. And they also sometimes denounced white liberals for compromising with their movement's sworn enemies. For example, during the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge to the Democratic National Convention in 1964. But in fact, in retrospect, one can really turn around the "It Isn't Nice" lyric that Reynolds sang on the other side, those who are opposing the movement. The nonviolent protests in the South and parts of the North, as the late historian Ken Camille put it, inverted the social order. Civil rights demonstrators were acting civilly, if at times illegally, leading local whites to act violently in response. And often the tactics of the movement were explicitly intended to provoke that kind of reaction. A famous example occurred in the spring of 1963 during the Southern Christian Leadership's campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. At first, demonstrators marched into the streets of downtown Birmingham peacefully. They were not harassed by city police, who were under the command of Eugene Bull Connor, who had recently lost a race for mayor in Birmingham and perhaps was thinking about running again. These peaceful marches, unharassed marches, went on for a couple of weeks. A state court in Alabama enjoined the SCLC, Martin Luther King Jr.'s group, from organizing further actions. King himself defied the ruling and went to jail on Good Friday. And he was released on Easter Sunday. In the meantime, he wrote a letter from Birmingham jail. He was frustrated, however, when he was released that the resurrection of his movement had not occurred. King, after getting out of jail, told Wyatt Walker, who was the chief local strategist for the SCLC in the Birmingham campaign, he said, "Wyatt, you've got to find some way to make Bull Connor tip his hand. And the way they found was to mobilize school children. On May 2nd, 1963, 1,000 kids filed out of the 16th Street Baptist Church and overwhelmed Bull Connor's men. This made Connor mad. He was being shown up. So the next day, when the children took off again, city firemen turned on high-pressure hoses to drive them off, sick their German shepherds from the police canine squads, which tore into their flesh. As you all know, that night, TV viewers all over the country saw the white South, especially white Southern authorities, at their worst. And most historians believe that after that day of violence in the streets of Birmingham, it was rather inevitable that President John Kennedy would propose a major civil rights bill, and probable, at least, that Congress would pass it. And of course, that bill finally did pass in 1964, after Kennedy's assassination. The question is, was it civil for the SCLC to organize nonviolent protests by school children in order to provoke a violent response? Because that's exactly what they were doing. After all, children were being put in harm's way purposely in order to get a reaction from the authorities of Birmingham. Was it civil to basically target Bull Connor and those who supported him, such as the governor of Alabama at the time, George Wallace, to call them basically moral villains? 1792, long before this, a senator from New Hampshire named William Plummer said, I think quite sensibly, he said, it's impossible to censure measures without condemning men. And so both at this time and throughout American history, when we say, well, let's take issue with their arguments but not condemn individuals, it'd be wonderful if we could do that, but it's very difficult because we tend to identify views we detest with the people who are articulating them. And it takes tremendous effort, I think, to separate those two things. Today, everyone from left-wing activists to mainstream Democrats to conservatives like Glenn Beck honors Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues. We have a national holiday dedicated, of course, to King as the symbol of this movement. But it's debatable, I think, whether these civil rights heroes were practicing civility, as we now understand that term, by putting school children in harm's way. At the same time, when a movement's behavior is widely considered uncivil by a majority of the population, it does hamper the advance of that movement. It forces activists and their supporters to defend their own actions instead of to keep the public's attention on the wrongs they are protesting. There are many examples, again, from the 1960s. Draft card burners, those who burned American flags and anti-war demonstrations, all of whom were nonviolent, but who clearly were generating much more opposition to what they were doing than they were support for what they were doing. Or take the Black Panther Party's ubiquitous slogan, "Off the pigs," which of course meant kill police. A lot of young, angry black people and young, angry white people also, like myself at the time, thought that this was a completely rational slogan. Police were being brutal towards black people in the ghettos, and they needed to fight back. But it was not a slogan which was going to do the Black Panther Party much good in the long term. The political theorist Michael Walzer, who's actually the co-editor of Dissent with me, has written about the need for dissenting intellectuals and activists to practice what he calls connected criticism. That is to show respect for the sensibilities of one's community and one's nation. Believing they were attacking evil authorities, some radicals in the 1960s unintentionally mobilized mass anger against their own uncivil behavior. They did not practice connected criticism, and they suffered for it. But the line that separates nonviolent acts that are uncivil from effective ones that are ineffective and counterproductive can shift over time. For example, take the sit-down strikes in auto plants and other industries in the mid-1930s. They certainly were uncivil acts. People were occupying other people's property and staying there, daring the authorities to get them out. They were making it impossible for, in Flint, Michigan, for example, for the General Motors Corporation, the largest corporation in the country, to do its business. But they helped to win union recognition for millions of wage earners, helped to build the Congress of Industrial Organizations. But 10 years later, attempts to use similarly coercive actions, sit-down strikes in places like Oakland, California, other places in 1946, helped turn public sentiment against organized labor. At the time, they were counterproductive. Very similar tactics, very different context. For that matter, strikes themselves, even when quite legal and scrupulously nonviolent, people just picking the outside, not occupying their workplace, have often been perceived as uncivil when the workers involved are viewed as either privileged or are viewed as essential to the operation of a vital part of the economy. Think, for example, the difference between the air traffic controller strike, the PATCO strike in 1981, which was declared illegal by President Ronald Reagan. The air traffic controllers union was disbanded. Most of the striking workers were fired. And compare when teachers go on strike today, which they seldom do because they know how unpopular it is, with the California farm workers strikes of the 1960s and 70s, which got tremendous amount of sympathy from the public. Again, context in the study of civility is everything. In her song, Malvina Reynolds was clearly aware of the shifting line between the civil and the uncivil. Her lyric, remember, implies that those who use uncivil behavior do so only when they're fairly certain that it will be effective, that it's the only tactic that will be effective. There's an if in her lyric. If that's freedom's price, we don't mind. The moral justification for breaking the law is not taken for granted, even when the laws in question were bolstering a manifestly unjust racist system. But we perhaps might need a wider definition of incivility as well. Perhaps the political allegiances, for example, of the woman who wrote those lyrics is relevant to the question of civility too. In the 1940s and 50s, Malvina Reynolds was a registered voter in the Communist Party of California and was married to a member of the Communist Party who was also a union organizer. Later, in an interview with a journalist, Malvina Reynolds recalled, quote, "The communist movement was our community." Now, her song, which praised peaceful, if uncivil behavior, was sung and memorized by people who helped win equal rights for Americans of color, and more generally, I think, helped to make the U.S. a more tolerant and diverse society. However, the larger movement to which she and her husband belonged was in thrall to, as we know, one of the most brutal, violent, and destructive regimes in all of history. To call Stalinist Russia uncivil is itself rather uncivil. In the U.S., the communist movement accomplished much of lasting value in the spheres of rights for African Americans and Mexican Americans, labor, immigrant rights, and even women's rights. Betty Friedan, for example, was a member of the communist movement, though not a member of the party. But its fatal flaw in the 1950s, not 1940s, not when she wrote Feminine Mystique. But the fatal flaw of the Communist Party was to believe that the monstrous regime in the Soviet Union was the wave of a more humane and democratic future. So what does that paradox mean for the history of civility? In the end, I think we should resist drawing lessons. And I think this echoes what Lisa was saying. We should resist, I think, drawing lessons about the civility or incivility of movements that are relevant to all times and all kinds of movements. Sometimes it's important to lay down strict moral lines, to recognize that something is not just unfair or irrational, but evil, and to use precise but passionate language to make that clear. But in every case, it's better to do so in a way that allows people to understand what you're saying and not to be turned off by it. Not to force those who don't agree with you or are not involved on the defensive, believing they have no alternative but to oppose everything you stand for and want to accomplish. I can think of no better example of a movement which did this intelligently and successfully than that of the recent uprising in Cairo. The resistors in and outside of Tahrir Square turned back the repression of the Mubarak regime, as we know, by stating eloquently and clearly both their grievances and their demands. And they refused to give in until they won. But they never initiated violence. They refrained from defaming institutions like the army and the mosque, which nearly all Egyptians cherish. And they were inclusive of nearly all sections of the population, without diluting the power of their message. But at the same time, we should also recognize that the individual act, which began what is now a wave of democratic revolt all over the Arab world, began with a very uncivil act by a young fruit seller named Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, who had been selling fruits from the age of 10 to help his family survive. who finally, at the age of 21, had just had enough of police repression, being dragged into jail for one petty violation or another, and decided to burn himself to death to protest the repression. This one very uncivil act was really the instigator in many ways of the rebellion in Tunisia, and the rebellion in Tunisia have helped to set off rebellions all over the Arab world. So there you have it. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Our final presenter today is Professor Thomas Sugrue. Thomas Sugrue is the David Boy Professor of History and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of Not Even Past, Barack Obama and the Burden of Race, published by Princeton University Press last year, and Sweet Land of Liberty, The Forgotten Struggle for Civil Rights in the North, published by Random House in 2008. That book was the main selection of the History Book Club and a finalist for the 2008 Los Angeles Times Book Prize. His first book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, published by Princeton University Press in 1996, won several awards, including the Bancroft Prize in American History. He is currently writing a history of 20th century America with Glenda Gilmore and working on a history of real estate in the modern United States. Professor Sugrue.
Great. Thanks very much to Professor Cornell, Clayton, and for Washington State for sponsoring this really stimulating conference. My comments are very much going to dovetail in a civil way with the previous three. But I want to begin with a reference to a famous quote from Frederick Douglass, who memorably argued that the arc of history bends towards justice. And I would argue, based on a reading of modern history, that just as often the arc of history veers off course. When the arc of history does bend towards justice, those doing the bending, I would argue, are just as likely, perhaps more likely, to be uncivil than they are to be civil. Change in the American past has resulted from a mixture of efforts to educate, to persuade, to convert, but also disruptive challenges to the political system that are often defined as uncivil. That mixture between persuasion and education and conversion and disruption, as Michael suggests, depends on context. What's the most efficacious at a particular political juncture? Particularly when political actors are weak, when they lack access to the mechanisms of the state, when they don't have a franchise, when they are marginal socially or economically, the tactics that they deploy are often uncivil or categorized by those whom they're challenging as uncivil. When the voiceless speak, often those who have power call them to civility as a way of silencing or softening the impact of their protest and dissent. I could offer many historical examples to illustrate my point: abolition and the emancipation of the slaves, or the rise of organized labor with sit-down strikes, or the IWW in Spokane, or the anti-war movement. But what I'm going to focus on, building really in some ways from my own work, but also riffing off of the comments of the last couple of presenters, is the history of civil rights. And I want to begin with one of the epochal moments in the history of civil rights, which is often evoked as an example of the power of civility and civil discourse to transform the political system. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality staged the Freedom Rides, challenging segregation in interstate bus transportation. You'll all recall the indelible images of the Freedom Riders Trailway bus beset upon outside of Anniston, Alabama, on fire, or the bus pulling into the terminal in Birmingham, the police disappearing, and the nonviolent Freedom Riders being hit with bricks, chains, and fists as they disembarked. Southern law enforcement authorities charged the Freedom Riders, despite their nonviolence, with a crime against civility, disturbing the peace. But even Corps' ostensible allies charged that the protests were polarizing and damaging to the cause of racial equality. Those critics included President John F. Kennedy, who worked behind the scenes, unsuccessfully, to bring the Freedom Rides to a halt. In a moment of incivility in the Oval Office, Kennedy ranted to his aide, Harris Wofford, who was closely tied to the nonviolent civil rights struggle and was important in bringing the tactics of Gandhian nonviolence to the United States. Kennedy said to Wofford, "Can't you get your goddamn friends off those buses? Stop them." In politer terms, Kennedy, who was deeply suspicious of what he called passionate movements and who preferred technocratic solutions to social problems, urged civil rights activists to be more civil, which in Kennedy's vision meant moving gradually by working through the political system for change rather than taking to the streets. Kennedy's efforts to stop the Freedom Rides failed, and indeed the Freedom Riders ended up pushing the federal government to enforce the Supreme Court decision that ruled that segregation in interstate transportation was unconstitutional. But more than that, the Kennedy administration's efforts to put a lid on civil rights protests were for naught. Over the next couple of years after the Freedom Rides, protests escalated across the country in places as diverse as Atlanta, Birmingham, Detroit, Philadelphia. Civil rights activists deployed tactics that increasingly pushed well beyond the boundaries of what was considered civil. Many protesters, even those who were schooled in nonviolence, were improvisational in their use of tactics. They responded to the political context and deployed strategies that ran the gamut of what was considered to be civil or uncivil at the moment. Michael mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference planning demonstrations in Birmingham, demonstrations that they planned fully aware of the cost of provoking Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, knowing that that cost would be high. But the events in Birmingham spurred a wave of protests nationwide, many of them even more disruptive than what happened in Birmingham. Indeed, just after King left Birmingham, many more impatient African Americans took to the streets of that city, breaking windows and looting stores, engaging in a form of political protest that would become increasingly common over the course of the 1960s and which few, if any, thought was civil. Observers declared 1963 to be the year of the Negro Revolt. In Philadelphia, civil rights activists took the anthem of the struggle, "We Shall Overcome," and they turned it into an ominous chant, a sort of rap. "We shall overcome. We shall overcome," banging together rolled up newspapers as a form of percussion, signaling a very different valence to that anthem of the movement. It was in this context, especially the disruption of 1963 in Birmingham and other places, that the Kennedy administration began drafting what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was not a top priority of the Kennedy administration. They did it only in response to the increasing threat of disorder on the streets of American cities. Kennedy's reaction to the Freedom Rides and the direction that the protests took in the early and mid-1960s fits uncomfortably with the wistful views of the civil rights movement that prevail today, a half-century later. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, widely perceived as un-American, as radical, as an extremist, has been repackaged as a voice of reason and moderation and of civility. But civility is in the eyes of the beholder. Whatever we think about the civility of activists in the Black freedom struggle, most who took to the streets were not thinking about fostering dialogue. Corps' Freedom Riders anticipated that by breaking Southern laws, they would provoke violent reprisals, just as King and SCLC had done in Birmingham. King and the SCLC were widely denounced by their House opponents, but also by moderates who claimed to support the goals of civil rights as extremists. They and countless activists who were not nearly so patient in the 1960s were seen as uncivil. When the civil rights movement was at its peak of popular support in 1964, most white Americans believed that civil rights activists and African Americans were pushing too far, too fast. For his part, Martin Luther King Jr. saved his harshest words for those advocates of civility. In the letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote, "I have reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but rather the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. King was the most prominent and nationally visible critic of gradualism and moderation in the civil rights struggle, but he wasn't alone. By the late 1950s, civil rights activists around the country had grown disaffected with the more civil tactics of the post-Second World War II generation, efforts to change the hearts and minds of white Americans through curricula, through sermons, through film, through popular articles. Advocates of racial dialogue attempted, following the advice perhaps most of Gunnar Myrdal, whose book The American Dilemma called for appealing to the American creed of equality. Education and persuasion, in the view of these activists, would lead the barriers of discrimination and prejudice to fall. But it quickly became clear that changing attitudes, or more superficially, changing the tone of racial discourse, had limits. Public opinion, at least as measured by surveys and polls, shifted decisively on matters of race between the 1940s and the 1960s. Overt expressions of racial prejudice began to lose their legitimacy. Large numbers of whites and politicians couched their opposition to civil rights legislation, such as laws that forbade discrimination in employment and housing, by professing that they were colorblind. And even the most vocal opponents of civil rights legislation argued that racial equality could not be legislated. Only reason, dialogue, and discourse, prayer, and reflection would lead to a shift in attitudes and behavior over time. By the late 1950s, civil rights activists, both North and South, began to see the limits of changing discourse, because a change in discourse did not necessarily lead to a change in practice. It was necessary but insufficient. The glacial pace of change led a growing cadre of activists to engage in uncivil activity, marching and protesting, and even calls for self-defense and revolt. For those activists who built on the strategy of Gandhian nonviolence, protest was meant in part to educate and persuade, but it was also meant to reveal the tensions and brutality that undergirded the system of Jim Crow. But most protesters, whether they deployed the tactics of nonviolence or not, saw protest as a form of wielding power and saw coercion as necessary to accomplish change. Social gains would not result solely or primarily from polite dialogue. They would result from pressure on the system. The history of the Black freedom struggle offers abundant evidence of the limits of civility. Dialogue and persuasion laid the groundwork but did not finish the business. The civil rights struggle threatened established power relationships. It undermined the structure of equality. It accomplished gains in the legislatures and the courts. It changed gradually the direction of history. The arc of justice, the arc of history bent towards justice, but it did so often because of the pressure of those who were impatient, impolite, and angry at the system, not simply though, or primarily those who were polite, civil, and mild-mannered in their depiction of the state of American politics in the mid-20th century. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom, and I want to thank all of our panelists, actually, for some very provocative comments. We're going to have time now for some questions and answers from the audience. If you have questions, I'm going to ask you to, we have a microphone in the audience. It's over here on the on my left-hand side, to step up to that microphone. And as folks do that, I have a couple of questions myself I want to ask of the panelists. I'm struck by a couple of things. The first thing I'm struck by is that we have a panel of 4 eminent historians and academics, and they're in agreement, which is, I think, the first time I've been on a panel where we have complete agreement. And their agreement seems to be that civility is not that important to democracy, or at least it is not essentially so. It's a tactic that can be used and should be used in some cases and not in other cases. That stands in stark contrast to what Stephen Carter said last night, in which he said democracy is really about a commitment to a common enterprise. It's a willingness to lose, in fact, your cherished interest, and it's not how you, or whether you win, but rather how you win. So here's my question. My question is there a difference between different types of incivility? Is there a difference between the type of incivility that is simply passionate debate about ideas or values or interests that we have versus the type of incivility that challenges the other's membership in our common enterprise? It challenges their citizenship, it calls them un-American, it somehow takes them out of the game that we're commonly committed to. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about that from the standpoint of history and some of these social movements.
I definitely think there are different kinds of incivility in our history. And what I would argue, and I think Tom pointed this out well, is that in cases where incivility, and Michael also pointed this, incivility is being used by social movements, by those on the outside of power, where there is no internal recourse. They do not have access, for example, with the civil rights movement to the vote, or for women with the suffrage movement, chaining themselves to the gates in Washington. This is a way for outsiders of the body politic to make one heard, to assert their democratic rights, and to become part of a body politic. So I think the incivility is somewhat different, that is often used by social movements, than a kind of incivility that is used by those who are insiders of the body politic. That is, those men and women who are utilizing incivility for preservationist means, who are threatened by alterations in sort of either cultural or social or economic power of those who are making new claims, and they're seeking to keep those individuals or social groups outside of the boundaries of power. So in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan would be an excellent example of a kind of preservationist incivility, which I think is precisely the kind that derides others' citizenship, who tries to write others out of the democratic body politic. And it's a far more dangerous form of incivility in my mind. I'll let others say a bit more.
Let me just very quickly, and then Michael can come in. I don't think Cornell that I was trying to suggest precisely what you were saying, and maybe I agree at least to some degree with Stephen Carter. I do think, as I said toward the end of my remarks, that it's partly about strategy. It's certainly about context, as Michael said. For historians, context is everything. But I also think it's more. I do myself want to hold to a kind of normative ideal, and I think my three fellow panelists may differ with me on this. I'm not sure. But I do think, as I suggested, that it's about strategy, but it also hints civility at an older notion, which is about intellectual engagement. It's about tolerance of differences. It is about being open and maintaining a certain civic dialogue. I think there is that element to it too. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, I think. Well, you know, if we don't have some sense of a common project, then we don't have a nation. You know, the Civil War happened because people in the South said we cannot abide the winner of this presidential election in 1860, and obviously that was the bloodiest war in American history between Americans. But you know, I think that one of the things which circulates around this subject is Americanism itself, which is, you know, one of the things, this is, you know, a truism for historians and probably for a lot of people in the room, but I'll state it anyway, that one of the things which makes America somewhat different, at least from a lot of other nations, not completely different, is that Americans are supposed to be united by a set of ideals rather than shared geography, shared history, shared ethnicity, and so forth, shared religion. And one of the things that means is that we're always saying, you know, we are better Americans than you are because we are better exponents of freedom and democracy than you are. And that was happening in a lot of the movements we talked about before. For example, the CIO used to call Henry Ford, who was very anti-union, used to call him King Henry, the I forget which one. It would have been ninth, I guess. And used to call their opponents Tories all the time, which was calling them un-American, in effect. But it was not considered outside the realm of civil discourse at the time. Richard Hofstadter, who I love to quote too, one of my favorite historians as well as Stephen Carter's, he said, "It has been our fate as a nation not to have ideologies, but to be one." And I think that, that's a very pregnant phrase in many ways. And I think part of what goes on in the United States, we talk about civility, is we want to say, we're better Americans than you, we're more civil, we can uphold these ideals better than you can. And very often that's what the battle is about. And that means that you can have ferocious battles about that, but at the same time there is a certain, I would argue, common set of ideals, which is, I think, a very good thing.
I would jump in and maybe offer a slightly different take of this that draws from the specific case that I elucidated in my presentation. Common enterprise. In the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, the common enterprise of white Americans was to deny citizenship to African Americans, to keep them in second-class status. A sizable segment of the white population did not want to give equal opportunity to African Americans, and many, many more were just plain indifferent to the condition of African Americans in the United States. One of the challenges that the civil rights movement offered, and one reason why it was widely perceived as uncivil, was that it was threatening that common enterprise. So we need, in other words, to think in historically contextual and specific ways about what commonality consists of. Commonality can be, as Michael suggests, the opportunity for creating a sense of solidarity necessary for political action and to accomplish change. But commonality can also be an obstacle. Commonality can be standing in the doorway, as Nina Simone suggested in that great song that Lisa quoted. One other thing about civility, I think civility enjoys such truck in the academy among political theorists and others because it makes the most sense when it's applied to our enterprise as intellectuals. That is, we ought to be civil in our discussion even when we have significant disagreements, because as academics and intellectuals, we believe that our enterprise is gathering information and presenting it in a way intended to persuade. Incivility forecloses the possibility, or at least makes more difficult the possibility of persuasion. But when it comes to the powerless, when it comes to people who are unrepresented in the political system, incivility can sometimes be the most important, or in some cases even the only tool available to accomplish change. And so I think the civility has a different place and maybe has in that mix of civility and uncivility that we all seem to agree on that characterizes American history. In some places civility is more warranted, in other places perhaps less.
I apologize, Fred, for mischaracterizing you. I knew it was impossible to have four academics agree.
Just a slight. I'm sorry, I know we have questions, but just very quickly for Tom. To see what you think of this, Tom. In terms of common enterprise, and in light of your opening comment just now, our African-American president, in a very powerful phrase, I think, calls us, I guess you could say, calls Americans to what he calls a tradition based on the simple idea that we have a stake in one another, and that what binds us together is greater than what drives us apart. Is that consistent with the point that you made at the outset? Because I sense a certain tension, or would you endorse Obama's that assertion?
I think as a least common denominator or ideal that we share a common humanity, absolutely. I mean, who couldn't endorse the idea in some ways that lots of people might not endorse it, but I would strongly endorse the concept. But on the other hand, it's one that's very kind of removed from the everyday of people's lived experience, socially, demographically, economically. And so one of the things that the civil rights struggle did do at various moments in the period from the 1930s on forward was to evoke a common sense of Americanness, to do what Michael was suggesting, to say in some ways that denying African Americans their fundamental rights made a white supremacist akin to Nazis, for example. And that was an uncivil but very common rhetorical move. They were un-American in this view, but it required making a particular claim on what it meant to be an American. And that's a claim that it wasn't always borne out, or seldom borne out, by the trajectory of American history for the previous 250 or 300 years.
I see we have a number of questions. I'm going to ask you to identify yourself and also to try to keep your questions as short as possible so we can get as many in as we can.
Answers as short as possible, too.
My name is Mehran Madani. I'm in design field, but I'm interested in history. I just want to ask you, first, I just want to thank for organizing this conference. It's a great topic, and a great moment, and the right time. I want to know about, I'm curious to know about your perspective as historians, to see democracy as a theory or a model, if through the history we can see this theory as a paradigm is shifting, or we can have a solid model and even export it to some other countries. As we see now, in that region, in Middle East region, I think those dictators, they didn't come with themselves. If we go back to history of Egypt 30 years ago, or Libya 40 years ago, the same leaders that they are accusing them for dictatorship, for example, for Mubarak, he denied to be their leader a few times, and they forced him to, as a hero of war. And in Libya, Gaddafi was Che Guevara of Libya, and they called him Che Guevara as a revolutionary. I think the problem is with the interpretation of the freedom, and what's the when they get to that point that they have freedom, what's the connection between freedom and democracy? How they can interpret that? And when they give unconditional power to those people, if it's me, somebody, it's not 1-2 cases. We can see lots of them in that region, and I think it goes back to the interpretation of freedom to democracy. How when they are free to vote for their leader, or when they are free to select one leader for themselves, I think that's the most important part. And I just want to ask you about your perspective about the future of democracy in that area. Thank you so much.
These are huge questions, and in 5 minutes, 4 of us are never going to be. We just barely scratched the surface. Very good questions. I mean, about why a great democratic leader becomes a dictator. Well, there's lots of examples of that. Mugabe in Zimbabwe, for example. There's many examples of that. I mean, power corrupts. Not always absolutely, but sometimes absolutely. I mean, that's an old story in history, going back to, Rome before in the Caesars era. But I think one of the things that is important about, and I'm no expert in the Middle East, and maybe other folks can comment on that, is that one of the things that's happened in the last 30, 40 years is that you have a lot of young people in these countries who have been able to travel, who use the internet, and they're part of a wider world of deliberative discourse, you might say. So you use Habermasian term, and they feel that it's their right to have an opinion and to voice that opinion, and to get together with people like themselves and people not like themselves and argue things out. And that's something which, as a right, is fairly new, that claim. And I think it's happened later, as I understand it, in that part of the world than it has in some other parts of the world. I might be wrong about that, but at least it certainly has come to the surface. And that's so crucial to what democracy means, and this is, here I'm agreeing with Stephen Carter on what he said last night. If you can't face people who disagree with you, at least somewhat, and talk to them and argue things out and feel like you might be able to convince them, then you haven't got democracy.
Well, just very quickly, it very much flows from what Michael is saying, and maybe this is the test for for the governments in the Arab world. Are you in a position to accept compromise solutions rather than demanding total victory? As we heard last night, are you willing to abide by election results and leave when the election doesn't go your way? It seems to me that those things are at the very heart of the democratic enterprise, and that's, I think, probably a very large question. Compromise is key. I'm fascinated by the standoff in Wisconsin. The governor has made very clear that he will not accept compromise. He's not going to stand down in the face of democratic opposition. That's certainly a novel notion, it seems to me, with respect to what democracy is, and we'll see what happens.
Hello, I'm Russell Dalton from the Center for Study of Democracy at UC Irvine. Although my question is a little critical, let me begin by saying that I agree with everything that you've said about the positive potential of in-civil activities. But I think the challenge in front of us today in this discourse is more complex because by definition, civility or democratic tolerance means not tolerating the people you agree with and are sympathetic with, but it's tolerating the ones you disagree with. And I was struck by how all of the examples seem to be examples of ones the speakers are sympathetic to, or the nation is now sympathetic to. And the real test of civility would be whether those same positive notions about the benefits of civility would apply if we were talking about other movements that one disagrees with. We have a lecture series at Irvine where the goal is to bring in a Republican politician one year and a Democrat the next. Every year I organized it, people came and complained. The only difference was who complained. If it was a Republican, ironically, the faculty complained. If it was a Democrat, being in Orange County, the community complained. The problem isn't being civil to the groups that we accept or accept their incivility, but if one looked at the Tea Party movement or the movements to secure American borders or the pro-life movements, would the panelists say that incivility is a good thing, like you said today? And that's the real crux of how do we balance off those two sides of the issues.
So I'd like to respond to that because, well, actually because I've worked on Orange County, which is one part of this. But I think that, it's something which Richard Hofstadter, again, Stephen Carter brought up his remarks about conservatism in the 60s. And he brought up his remarks in terms of Richard Hofstadter sort of looking at this as a real problem and his Manichaean view of this conservative movement as a kind of uncivil discourses outside the bounds of American politics. And I think what's interesting to me is that I think you're right in the sense that it's really important not to simply dismiss the other side, which is in some ways what Richard Hofstadter was doing in talking about those conservatives in the 60s. He wasn't taking them seriously. He was simply condemning them, and across the board, from those who would now be considered respectable conservatives like Barry Goldwater to the John Birch Society. And by condemning them, he really, I think, misunderstood and didn't hear what the sort of broader claims of the movement were and its power. And I think there's a problem there. But what I would also say is that this issue is not something which is new, and that's what I find so interesting is the level of concern about civility is new. But the reality is that we have had enormous kinds of debates and disagreements, and Orange County is obviously a rife place for that, much earlier, between Democrats and Republicans. And not only that, but within the parties. So, for example, I think a good example is in the 60s, Republicans termed one another. Scranton labeled Barry Goldwater, his campaign, as having the stench of fascism. Another Republican moderate claimed that his positions were a crazy quilt of absurd and dangerous positions. So we've had this kind of discourse for a long time. I think maybe what's different about today, and that's an interesting thing to think about, is that it's with the polarization is very much a partisan polarization. The parties themselves are far more ideologically disciplined and identified in a way that earlier you had debates within the Republican Party or within the Democratic Party. Now there is no more reaching across the aisles because parties are not as loosely formed as they once were. And I think that heightens a sense of the incivility in the public square because it heightens a sense of the incivility in Congress. That, and I think something that Fred pointed out in his abstract but didn't mention, is that, of course, and the extent to which the media drives, I think, our sense of the strong nature of incivility, because certain voices have an enormous strength, not equal to their numbers, but enormous influence. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but I do think that you're pointing to something important, but there's not something fundamentally new or different about the fact that, your Democrats on campus complain because Republicans come, or Republicans complain because Democrats come. Is that an issue? Should we respect one another? Yes. But it's interesting to me that this is becoming such a point of debate today when we've had far more rife conflicts and disagreements in our nation's past than we do at the present moment. Conversation.
Real quickly, just on the Tea Party, arguably the incivility of some Tea Party candidates kept Republicans from controlling the Senate right now, up in 2010. If it wasn't for comments by, I'm forgetting her name now, Sharon Angle in Nevada, for example, about maybe we need to pick up our guns and overthrow the government. She didn't say exactly that, but that was the content of it. She would have defeated Harry Reid, and if it wasn't for Christine O'Donnell making various uncivil comments in Delaware, and for that matter, Tea Party people uncivilly attacking the very moderate Republican who ran against her in the Republican primary, those two seats probably would have been won by Republicans. And there are a couple other examples as well. So in that sense, the same point I was making about left-wing movements in the 60s, how incivility at different times hurt their success, I think can be made about the Tea Party.
And I would just say very quickly, I think I see, are you up? Yeah, you're right on the top. Tocqueville, I think here again is quite interesting, precisely on the point that you made. Tocqueville's view, maybe it was a bit Pollyanna-ish, but his view was that it was precisely that ability that Americans had, despite the noisy public square, the ability that Americans had, unlike his fellow Frenchwomen, to tolerate differences, to in fact to listen to one another and to work out agreements, was why he believed, notwithstanding his criticisms of American democracy, why it was functioning. The French, to their fatal dismay, or whatever the phrase would be, the French were unable, had been unable to reach that kind of accommodation. And my guess is, you didn't articulate this point, but my guess is that your speaker series went on. There were these protests from faculty on the one hand and the community on the other, but you had this speaker series. It seems to me you should. And Tocqueville would say that in some way it works as it should.
Just a quick follow-up in the spirit of Stephen Carter's wonderful storytelling last night. One of my favorite headlines from The Onion, the great satirical online and in-print newspaper, was in the immediate aftermath of Bush v. Gore. The headline on The Onion showed folks engaged in pitched civil war, of Tennessee being occupied by, by pro-Bush troops, and it was a reminder of the ways in which that Tocquevillian insight into toleration of difference played out even in what was arguably the most polarized political race of our lifetime. And so I think there are very important ways in which recognition of those differences is a common current running through American politics, even if incivility is often a tool, and civility is often a tool in the hands of those who are looking for leverage in the political system.
Good morning. I'm Kenton Bird from the University of Idaho. One reason why the civility topic has bubbled to the top of the national conversation, I think, is at least the perception that there's a connection between extreme political rhetoric and political violence. And I'm wondering if this panel of esteemed historians might provide some lessons from American history as to when the rhetoric became so inflated and exaggerated that people did turn to violence, and whether there's a self-regulating mechanism in place that will help keep that in check, or should we be concerned about the level of political speech and the potential to spill over into such things as political assassination?
Well, again, I don't think it's not a quantitative question. Yes, so much angry rhetoric at a certain point tips over into violence. I mean, the media talks that way. I don't think it's true. I don't think it works that way. Again, I hate to be boring as an historian, but it depends on the context. There was a lot of angry rhetoric in the Congress for many years in the antebellum about slavery, and as you know. John Quincy Adams, after president, he tried to bring this question up on the floor of Congress. Eventually, there was a gag rule against petitions, being circulated at all, and so forth. But Civil War didn't break out right away. It took a lot of other things to happen, like the Mexican War and the debate about what was going to happen to those territories in terms of slavery seized from Mexico. So, I think it's there's lots of examples in American history, and my colleagues and folks out there can multiply them endlessly. I think where there's tremendous amount of angry rhetoric, but there's not much violence. 1800 election was mentioned, for example. Other times when violence breaks out, and yeah, the rhetoric is there. But again, as we were all saying, the rhetoric is always there. It's not again whether all of a sudden it tips over.
I find myself with a question. I'm Michael Kroos. I'm the director of the Timberland Regional Library. I seem to find myself chasing my tail on this issue because it seems in a sociologically and economically stratified society that someone else is always going to be defining for me, meaning I'm the outside person from the body politic, what is civilized behavior or civil discourse in a democratic society. The only way, to me, it seems that I can get someone else's attention is to offend your sensibilities as to what is civil discourse, without ever defining in my own mind what is civil discourse from my point of view as an individual. How do you reconcile that? I'm finding myself running around trying to figure out how do we do this.
Anyone want to tackle that?
That might be one best left to the philosophers.
That's called punting, I think.
Yes.
I mean, all I can say is that if most people think something's uncivil, it's uncivil. I mean, that's democracy and civility.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panel for a very civil discussion and our audience for a very civil discussion. Let me just say we're going to take a short 15-minute break. We'll reconvene here at about quarter after or so for our next panel, which is a panel of scholars of religion to look at the relationship between civility and democracy and the role religion has played in that. I hope you'll join me now in thanking our panels for a very intellectually stimulating discussion.